Hello, I'm Susan Krumdieck, Professor of Mechanical Engineering, and you have found the Transition Engineering Podcast, where we talk about how to make the energy transition work. Hello, we are here at the Transition Engineering Podcast again. Thank you for joining us. We are broadcasting from Munich again. This show is coming from Munich. It is a beautiful summer day, even though it's only June. Been lovely here. And I am with Philip again.
Hello.
And Belen.
Hi.
And our topic for today is going to cover a few things. We're going to cover the history of how we look at our position in the universe, basically. What's it like to live on a finite planet? And we're going to look at the mathematics that people have used to sort of think about where we're going. And then we're going to look at our response to that information. And then we're going to look at our own psychology and our own understanding about the future. So that sounds like a lot, and it was quite vague, sorry. But what we're going to do is we're going to use an interesting little story to illustrate that. So I think it won't be too vague once we get going. I want to know, young folks, have you heard of The Limits to Growth? It was a book published in the 70s.
No.
Limits to Growth.
I have not, no.
Okay.
Me neither.
All right. Well, we have talked before about the oil crisis, 1973 OPEC oil embargo, right? We talked about that.
Yeah.
There was a political disagreement, and the oil-producing countries of the Middle East cut off the United States and the West from oil supply. This was actually quite a huge crisis. It occurred right about the same time that there were a lot of environmental crises. Really, before the 1960s, people did not throw away trash the way we do now. The amount of packaging, the amount of disposable products was just really not at all what it is now. And funny enough, the waste management systems that we use now and that we take for granted didn't exist then either. Yeah. So the ways to deal with toxic waste, the ways to deal with our household rubbish, the way to deal with industrial rubbish, it was sort of just being dumped all over the place. And there was a incident called the Love Canal incident where a company spread some pretty bad toxic waste on a road in a community to keep it was contaminated oil, to keep the dust down.
Oh.
And
oh my God.
Yeah, and a huge number of people got really sick. And this brought to light that problem that we were not dealing with toxic waste. Yeah. It also became quite clear that we were not dealing with municipal solid waste because it was everywhere. It was in the streets, it was in the parks, it was everywhere. So engineering stepped up and came up with ways to collect that rubbish, to put it into landfills, to compress it, to track where toxic waste is going. And we got better at that. But if you put together our waste management issues and our energy supply issues, you can understand the way that people started to see the world at that time. Also put into that formula that image of the Earth as the little blue ball floating in space. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Yeah, that was new at that time.
Beautiful.
Yes, the NASA had sent astronauts out into orbit, and they looked back and they took that image. Yeah. And those astronauts also started speaking about what it felt like to look back at the planet, which to them had always seemed infinitely large, and see it as a isolated little ball floating in space. And if you put all those things together, you start to see why there started to be questions about our future. And there was a group of people who they were called the Club of Rome, and they got together and they started doing some analysis. Okay, Well, we're using oil at this rate. How much oil is there? We're cutting down forests at this rate. How many forests are there? What are all the things that we're using? How fast are we using them? And how long would they last? Can we keep growing the amount of stuff we use every year? They did those calculations. Spoiler? They found out we lived on a finite planet and that there are limits to growth.
Really?
Right. So you can imagine this book comes out. It comes out into this this atmosphere, this climate of people thinking, something's going wrong, and then here's these people saying, within 30 years, we're going to run out of all sorts of things that we find essential now, if we keep growing our demand for them. All right, well, here we are. We're 30 years later, plus 40 years later, and we are still using oil. We're using oil much more per year than we were in the 70s. So what happened? Were they wrong? Sounds like they were wrong.
Yeah.
And when I talk to people about sustainability, a lot of people will bring this up. Well, what about the Club of Rome? They predicted that if we kept growing our use of oil, as had been doing before the oil crisis in the 70s, that we would be out of oil within 30 to 40 years. It would be gone. If you have access to Google, then look at the history of oil production. Look at that curve. And you will see that the growth rate, the exponential growth of oil consumption, was pretty darn impressive.
Yeah.
And if you use some pretty simple mathematics, you can get the same result that they did, which is all the known oil would indeed be consumed, because that curve hits a hockey stick, exponential growth, doubling every so many years. That's what it does. Do you have any doubt about that, the way exponential growth works? Pretty simple math, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, we can say it's simple math, and we can laugh at people who might not think it's simple math. But this is where my little story comes in for you. It's not that simple to really wrap your head around. When I was an undergraduate at University of Colorado in Boulder, there was a professor there, Albert Bartlett. He was in the physics department, and he gave a lecture, and he titled it basically the one simple fact that humanity must understand. And he said this one simple fact, it's a very simple thing, it is the reason why we're really a danger to ourselves. So I went to the lecture. I thought, oh, yes, this sounds good. And he started off the lecture, and here's what he said. Let's do a mental experiment. Let's say that I have a jar, and it's full of the sort of nutrient broth that you can grow bacteria in. It's full of food for bacteria. Mm-hmm. And I have a bacteria, and the bacteria is the kind that doubles every minute. So at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to put one bacterium into the jar.
Yeah.
At 9:01, how many bacteria do I have?
2.
Okay. At 9:02, how many bacteria do I have?
4.
And at 9:03?
8.
Okay, good.
Obviously, yeah.
The bacteria are doubling their population every minute.
Yeah.
So we see how this is going. And what I'll tell you is that I've done this experiment with exactly 50 milliliters of the broth. Yeah. And every day, every time I do it, by noon, the jar is completely full of the bacteria. The colony has, the population has exploded. It's filled the jar. The food is gone, and the bacteria are dying in their own excrement.
How rude.
Yes. So we can all, laugh at these poor bacteria, but that's what they do. That's their role in the ecology, is that when there's a dead thing, their population must absolutely be able to boom, to consume the dead thing, to convert it back to nutrients, or we would be up to our necks in dead things. If bacteria grew slowly, we would be in trouble.
Yeah, true.
So they fulfill their role. It's fine.
Yep.
So his question then was, okay, so everyone, brilliant college students that you are, tell me this. When is the jar half full? And I have to say that me and my other brilliant colleagues there were sitting there going, okay, well, if we knew the doubling rate and we knew if we knew what the consumption rate of food was per bacteria, then we could write down the equation N equals N naught times 1 plus R, and so we'd have to figure out what the rate of growth is from the doubling rate to the power time, and we could figure it out, but we're missing a few things. We're missing, we're sort of struggling. We're missing some information.
But it's easier.
It's easier than that. If we flip, it's true, we could figure it out that way from here forward. But we'd need more information. But if we flipped around our perspective to go to noon and ask the same question backwards, we actually have all the information we need.
Yeah, we have.
If we start with the catastrophe at the end, we would be able to tell when the jar is half full.
Right.
Yeah.
So, answer?
It's 1 minute before noon.
Yes, exactly. And I love to tell this story to my classes or to lectures because while there's a few kids who see that, we, at least engineers, we like to start at the beginning and try and work our way to the end.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people do the same thing I did in the lecture, which is to, I know there's an equation for this, I can figure it out, when actually the answer is pretty obvious, that if you keep growing that way, that was the stipulation, these bacteria can't change how they grow.
Right.
If you keep growing that way and you double every minute, then if you look at how much you actually have, it isn't that hard to tell when you're halfway finished.
Right.
All right. So that's an interesting thing, and that was the main part of his lecture. And he went on to look at, okay, if we keep growing at the rate we are now, in how many houses we build, if we keep growing at the rate we're growing now, in how much sewer we produce, how much water we use, all these things, he would do these calculations, and within 20 years. It was impossible, right? And it would just boggle your mind. Wait a minute. We would need 3 more sewage plants within 20 years if we keep growing the way we are or the way we have been. A good example, in New Zealand, we get most of our electricity for our country from hydro, from rivers and glacial lakes. And if we keep growing at 2% per year, in 40 years, we're going to need another island.
Yep.
Oh my God.
Right? So when you have a jar, when you live on an island, these are surprising findings, right? That if you keep growing, you get to some limit or you exceed a limit. If you keep growing, okay, but that's what we want to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We need growth. Economics says we need growth.
Yeah.
How do we get jobs if we don't have growth? That's what are we going to do? All right. Well, I think this is getting a little difficult. So what I would like to do is I would like to revisit our bacteria. But use your imagination for a minute. I want to go inside the colony of bacteria and see what they're thinking.
Okay.
All right, fair enough. All right, but I don't want to go in there at the last minute because that doesn't look like it was a very good minute.
Okay.
So I want to go inside the jar. Let's go in and let's visit the bacteria and see what's going on at 10 minutes till noon. How about that?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, 10 minutes till noon. That means that the colony has been growing and thriving and having a good time for 170 generations. They've been going.
Yeah.
Right? All right, so for those 170 generations, there really hasn't been any constraint. How much of the jar are they taking up at 10 minutes till noon?
Well, not that much.
Well, at a minute before noon, it's half.
Yeah.
2 minutes before noon, 1/4.
1/10.
It turns out at 10 minutes before noon, it's 1/1000th.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can barely see them. They're a speck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they are not that worried about limits to growth at that point.
Yeah.
And they've had so much progress. They have bacteria universities. They have bacteria smart technologies. They're really having a good time, right? They have bacteria economists. They've they're having a pretty good time.
Yeah.
All right. So it turns out that at 10 minutes till noon, there are some scientist bacteria, and they have invented a new measurement system. And they have used that measurement system to look out beyond the extent of their colony. And they have found an edge. Right? They found a bottom, they found an edge, and they found a lid. And we're in a jar. There's a finite amount of food. Well, I mean, there's way more than we could ever use, clearly, right? There's an infinite amount of food, but it's interesting that there's an edge.
Yeah.
And then some mathematician bacteria go, oh, yeah. And they sit down and they use that simple mathematics. And they say, well, at the rate we're going, it could be about noon that we could run out of food. And some of the other scientists go, well, that's only 10 generations away. And, that seems a bit alarming. And so one of the scientist bacteria gets a talk on TED B, does a TED talk.
TED B.
TED B for bacteria.
Yeah. TED B.
So this famous scientist does a TED talk and explains about their instrument and their science and what they found, this edge. And and the other bacteria are pretty interested. Oh, an edge. Oh. And then he says, and look at this mathematics. Within about 10 minutes, we could hit the edge. Oh my gosh, that's quite alarming.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh dear. So some of the bacteria, when they hear this, they get a little upset. But you know what? It fits their worldview because we are all doomed anyway, right? There's these legends that the bacteria have of the doom, the end of days when, yeah, and probably it's true because that's bacteria's life. But but yeah, so they expect to be doomed. They expect the world to come to an end. They expect to die in their own excrement. So for some of the bacteria, it fit their worldview, and they were pretty happy about it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, well, some of the other bacteria thought, oh, gosh, I'm going to get my own piece of the jar, and I'm going to build a wall around it, and I'm going to defend it, and I'm going to get weapons, and, I'm not going to let anybody have mine.
Yeah.
That could happen.
Got some of those. Yeah.
That could happen. Yeah. Going to get my piece. All right. And some other bacteria are thinking, these guys are pretty alarmist, really, because look at the way our bacteria economics works. We keep growing, everything gets better, and as we use more is brought into the market.
Yeah.
Growing.
It's just the way it is, right? Why should we stop growing? Alarmists. Yeah, okay. We've got some of those too. All right. And then the scientist bacteria say, well, we need to study it more because we aren't quite sure if our colony would hit the wall at 1 minute before noon or at a minute after noon or at noon and 34 seconds. There's some uncertainty in our models and some uncertainty in our measurement of how big the jar is. So we need more funding to do more research.
Yeah.
And that leads some of the other bacteria to say, what? They don't even know. There's uncertainty. We can't think about changing anything or not enjoying what we're doing and dividing every minute if they don't even know for sure what's going on. Yeah. And then there's some other bacteria that say, hey, the politicians need to take action on this jar problem. And they get together and they spell out jar in their little bodies and they take a picture and they post it online. Oh, yeah.
You're fading away.
Oh, dear. So then, well, let's see. What other bacteria have we got in there? We've got some other bacteria that say, we should really question how we're doing things. Maybe we should slow down how fast we divide. But those bacteria are really not within the normal, and people don't understand what they're saying, and so they sort of just speak into the void. And then we've got the entrepreneur bacteria. And we've got, Elon bacteria. We got this guy. He is going to save the whole colony. And you know how he's going to do it?
Tell me.
Gigafood. We can generate our own renewable food. And everybody goes, yay! And then and then he says, and then I can build a craft. We'll take off. We'll go find new sources of food. All right, good. And so everybody's cheering, yay. And sure enough, they launch out into the lab and they find 2 more jars of food.
Wow.
Exactly. Now what's the problem? You see, we can overcome all obstacles. Well, brilliant kids.
I give you 1.5 minutes.
Exactly. It didn't exactly solve the problem. As long as the parameters are the same, that we're going to just keep doubling every minute, it doesn't matter how much we find. We've still got this bacterial problem of being bacteria. All right. Well, I don't know if all of this sounds a little bit like us sometimes. Because it can't be possible that we're not smarter than bacteria, right?
Yeah, it can.
All right. So you would think that we would be able to look at evidence, understand that uncertainty is just uncertainty. It doesn't change the actual reality, right? Uncertainty doesn't change reality.
Yep.
All right. And you would think that we could understand what we need to change. Well, let's look at the historical evidence.
Yeah.
We talked about limits to growth. And if the growth in oil consumption had continued, we would have run out by now. So what changed? Because obviously something changed. We didn't run out by now. The growth rate changed. I told you to Google it and look at the curve for history of oil production, and what you will see is a distinctive downward trend about 1973, 74, all the way through the early 80s.
Yeah.
All right. The growth rate did not continue. Then we got back onto an upward growth pattern, and when there's a recession, go down a little bit, go down a little bit. And if we continued on that growth rate, indeed, you would see that we would run out by about 2050.
Yes.
Now look at the later decade, the last decade or so. Since 2008, what you will see is that growth has slowed down a lot. In fact, it leveled off and didn't grow for a while, went back down. So what does that mean? That when we look forward with mathematics, looking at the growth rate trend that we're on, we can see where that projection of that trend will take us. And it doesn't look good. It looks like we're going to run out. And then the fact that we don't run out, does that mean our math was wrong?
No.
What it means is that the assumption about our ability to continue a continuous growth rate is wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So when we look at trajectories of the future and we see that the business as usual path that we look at takes us to a place that's impossible, what we know is that we're not going to go there. Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Can you think of any other things like that? Any things that we're talking about now? That there's this pathway forward, this trajectory we're on, and this belief that we all have about where that's taking us.
And there are a lot of myths going around.
Yeah? What's your favorite one? You have one?
Yeah, some of them you destroyed them.
Oh.
Like, a switch to electric vehicles, replacing fuel vehicles at once.
Right. And here's the thing. electric vehicles are obviously possible,
Yeah.
but the trajectory of continuous growth of use of vehicles,
Yes.
and that somehow electric vehicles is going to allow that to continue, that's the thing that future just doesn't work out like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so vehicles. Oh, okay, here's one. If we looked at how many vehicles were on the road, let's try this one.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the first Bond movies, the James Bond? You know what I'm talking about, James Bond.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
When were those first movies made? Was that Sean Connery or somebody? The first Bond?
Yeah.
1960s.
60s,
Yeah, right there.
yeah.
Yeah, so the 1960s. Picture James Bond. And picture James Bond is he in a car?
Yeah.
In fact, he's got a very cool car, yeah? He has got a really cool car, Aston Martin, and he's driving it around. And there was one of the shows where he was in the Alps and he's driving around. If we were to look up the number of cars in Europe in the 60s, what do you think we would find?
Maybe
Very,
close
very less.
Less than half.
way less than
Way
half.
less than half.
Yeah.
So here's James Bond driving around, doing crazy things. And just imagine whatever city you're in Europe, has that city changed a lot since the 60s? It's changed.
Yeah, but not that much.
The actual physical feeling of that city, what it's like to walk down your street, probably hasn't changed that much from the 60s as far as
No.
how
no.
wide the street is, how tall the buildings are. All right.
No, it hasn't.
Now picture that street with about a fourth the number of cars.
Mm.
Yeah, that changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you ever get up in the morning on a Saturday or a Sunday, I know young people don't tend to do that, but if you do, if you get up early in the morning and you go out into your city, it's kind of like it was in the 60s.
Yeah.
There's very few cars. Now, there's a lot of cars parked, but the number of cars moving around is way less than the rest of the week. And just imagine that's what your city was like in the 1960s.
Mm.
All right. In the 1960s, people were spending maybe, half an hour a week in a car because people didn't use cars very much.
Okay.
They would use the car on the weekend to do a few things, maybe go out for a drive, maybe go get some goods. If we went back to the 60s right now, so 1 minute before noon or so, and we tell people then, you know what, in the future, there's going to be this many cars.
Yeah, they wouldn't believe you.
No, and they would think, why would we do that? That would be really congested. That would be noisy. That would be hard to get across the street. And if you said, and as a bonus, you're going to get to spend on average about 10 times more time in your car than you do now.
Oh my god.
Because being in a car is a good thing, right? It's great to have a car. And you want to spend 10 more times than you, or even more than that in your car in the future, right?
Mm.
Right. So we are funny creatures. I don't know that anybody could have actually predicted that in the 60s. It would have been really hard to conceive that there could possibly be that many cars.
Yeah.
Or that people could be driving for those lengths of time, living out 2 hours from Munich and coming into Munich to work. That would who would do that? That'd be nuts.
That's nonsense.
Right. But use the trajectory for the future and
Yeah.
tell people now that there will be way fewer cars. They wouldn't believe you.
Could be that they wouldn't believe me. I would hope that if I said, look, if we continue this trajectory of more cars, within 20 years, look at what Munich looks like.
Yeah.
Ugh. I think we would all agree that we can't go there. That's not nice.
No.
That takes our beautiful place and turns it into a parking lot. We don't really want to do that. So I guess the point of the story, the actual punchline, the moral of the story, is that it's hard to think about the future either way if it's different from what our experience is.
Yes.
That's fine that it's hard. If the mathematical trajectory takes us to a place that isn't good, that we don't want to go to, then how hard is it to be the bacteria in the jar who says, you know what? You're right. If we don't change, that is what the mathematics looks like. But we can't go there. We will change something. We'll transition to a different way of doing things before that happens. And there might be some of the bacteria in the jar who get stimulated by that project, by thinking about, okay, what is that change then? How would we accomplish that change? And what are the better things about that? Yeah, fair enough.
Fair enough.
All right. I guess since we're talking about population explosion, we should bring up one last little thing, which is population. Again, do you guys have a sense of what the population of the Earth is at the moment?
Yeah.
No.
Do you?
8 billion?
Oh, I don't think we've quite got to 8, have we?
But yeah, but
We're heading for it.
That's what we're heading for. Okay, that's the right direction, isn't it?
It's pretty high. Now, how old are your grandparents?
80.
80.
All right. Let me tell you that when they were your age, the population was about 2 billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
So now we start to understand why James Bond's world was not so congested, and he could drive around the city in his car and chase bad guys.
Yeah.
So population. A lot of times when I'm talking about the future, I get people who, want to do that doomsday thing. Well, if we don't control population, then we're all doomed anyway. Well, that is a really tough question. And I guess what I would say is that, when I look at a forward projection of population, if nothing changes or if we continue with historical birth rates, death rates, growth rates, we do get to a place where, according to the limits of growth, we run out of what it takes to sustain us. We run out of agricultural land. We run out of water. We run out of space. It's not good.
It is.
Yeah.
Are we bacteria? Will we change how we do things? And I guess the good news is that to a certain extent we already have.
Yeah.
Right? The historical population growth rates have slowed down. They are slowing down. There still is population growth. But in a lot of countries like Germany, actually the population growth is flat. It isn't growing anymore. So the growth isn't happening. The population has kind of stabilized of native-born people. How many babies people have has backed off.
Yeah.
So, the United Nations thinks that trend is going to continue. And there's been a lot of research that has linked that slowing down of the birth rate to women having other things to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but
We
it's
do
true.
have other things to do. It doesn't devalue children at all to have less of them. And it doesn't devalue children at all for people to decide not to have some of their own.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing. We're not seeing a devaluing of children. We're seeing possibly even a higher value put on children because they're more precious and we have fewer of them per 1,000 people.
Yeah.
All right.
That's true.
So I don't see that. I mean, we do have a large population now, that's for sure. and the interesting problem of reducing population like they have in Japan. They've actually had a couple decades where their population growth rate has reversed. It's actually a struggle to deal with it, which is interesting. But that's the future indeed. All right, I hope you've enjoyed our little foray into the jar and see what we've learned from visiting the bacterial colony. And thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next time.
Yep.
Yeah.
See you.
See you.
Bye bye.